All right, gang, so now we're here into video 2. This is the second half of chapter 0. We're going to be talking about rhythm and meter today, or in other words, this is how music is metered out through time. So here we go. Let's get into the content. All right, so to get started, we have this chart here that shows you the common rhythmic values, and at the top of it, you see a whole note. The whole note gets its name because it fills up the whole of a measure in 4/4 time. What that means we'll get to in a bit. A whole note can be divided into two equal parts, and they're called half notes. Two halves equal a whole, just like in math and fractions. Likewise, we can cut a half note in half, and two halves of a half are called quarters. We can cut a quarter in half, and half of a quarter is an eighth, and likewise, an eighth note cut in half is a 16th note. And as those fractions go down, you can see that there are 16 16th notes in a whole note. There are 8 eighth notes in a whole note, and so on. So everything lines up pretty evenly all the way through. The quarter note in the middle is the most common note value that we're going to deal with this semester, and the quarter note typically gets 1 beat of time for that note. The same fractional relationships that divide the whole note into two halves and that in one half into two quarters also applies to how long we count them. If a quarter note gets 1 beat, it takes 2 quarter notes to equal 1 half note, so a half note gets 2 beats. 2 half notes equal 1 whole note, so 2 times 2 equals 4 beats. A whole note gets 4 beats, which is covered by 4 1-beat quarter notes. In the other direction, 1 beat for a quarter note is divided into 2 eighth notes, so each eighth note gets half of a beat. 2 16th notes equal 1 eighth note, so each 16th note gets half of a beat, or a quarter of a beat. If you multiply 16 times 1 quarter, you end up with 4 beats for a whole note yet again. The next topic are dots. You can see here in this example from your textbook the dots next to the half note, the quarter note, and the eighth note. A dot, in the simplest terms, will add half of whatever it is connected to back to that note value. A dot next to a half note will take half of the half note. The half note is worth 2, so half of 2 is 1. So the value of a dotted half note is 2 plus 1, or 3 beats. In the example of the quarter note, a quarter note is 1 beat. The dot is worth half of what is connected to, so half of 1 is a half. So 1 plus a half equals 1.5 beats for a dotted quarter note. For an eighth note, the dot takes half of the eighth note, half of a half, which is 1 quarter, so a dotted eighth note is 3/4 of a beat. The next bit of musical math are ties. Ties are another way of adding note values together. When you see a tie, you add the two notes rather than having two individual notes. In this example, also from page 9 of your textbook, you can see a couple different examples of ties. In the first example, you have a whole note tied to a quarter note. So you have a 4-count note added to a 1-count note, so this note is sustained for a total of 5 counts. In the second example, you have an eighth note tied to a half note. An eighth note gets a half a beat, a half note gets 2 beats, so this is a sustain for 2.5 beats. In the last example, you have a half note, which is 2 beats, tied to a 16th note, which is a quarter of a beat. So this note is sustained for 2 1/4 beats. This can apply to any kind of combination of note values to include dotted note values. The next example on page 9 are triplets. You can see here that a triplet is a way of breaking a note into more than 2 parts. In this case, we're breaking it into 3 parts. When you see the 3 around a bracketed group of notes, that is telling you those 3 notes are filling the same space as 2 notes. In the first example on the left, a half note breaks normally into 2 quarter notes. The 3 with a bracket is telling you that these 3 notes will be spaced in the same space as 2 quarter notes. So the quarter note triplet takes up the same amount of time as 2 quarter notes, or 2 beats. In the example on the right, the 3 with the bracket over the eighth notes is saying that those 3 eighth notes will be evenly spaced in the same space as 2 eighth notes. That equals 1 quarter note. In class, we talked about how music is a combination of sounds and silences. The notes that we've learned are all ways of knowing when and how long to make a sound. On page 10 in your book, you're introduced to rests, which are how we indicate silence. When a musician sees a rest, they do not make a sound. In this example from page 10, on the top line, you see all the common note values that we'll talk about: a whole note or 4 beats, a dotted half note or 3 beats, a half note is 2 beats, then we see a dotted quarter note, a quarter note, a dotted eighth note, an eighth note, a dotted 16th, and finally a 16th note, which is 1/4 of a beat. Lined up with each of these note values on the bottom line are what their rests look like. So on the left, you see a whole note rest or a whole rest. This is 4 beats. Then a dotted half rest, which is 3 beats. Then a half rest, 2 beats. A dotted quarter rest, which is a beat and a half. A quarter rest, which is 1 beat. And a dotted eighth rest, an eighth rest, a dotted 16th rest, and finally the 16th rest. You can see by going through this math quickly that just like with sounds, the dots affect the silences the same way. The dot adds half of which precedes it. On pages 10, 11, and 12 in your book, now we get into meter. Meter is how we actually divide time into musical subdivisions so that a musician can read music and play with time and rhythm. In meter, we talk about 2 different kinds of breakdowns of meter: simple meter and compound meter. Simple meter is where the beats are divided into groups of 2, and in compound meter, it divides into groups of 3. Both simple and compound meters are grouped also by how many beats are in a measure. You can have duple, triple, or quadruple meters. If it's quadruple, there are 4 beats in a measure. Triple meter has 3 beats, and duple has 2 beats in a measure. The most common time signature that we're going to deal with is simple quadruple, or 4/4. 4/4 means 4 beats in a measure, and the quarter note gets the beat, and the quarter note is divided into 2 equal parts. On page 12 of your book, you can see a chart that breaks down all of the different combinations of simple, compound, duple, triple, and quadruple meters, and what those time signatures might look like. That brings us to the end of the discussion of rhythm and meter out of Chapter 0. Be sure you read the book and use the online tools from Norton's website so that you're ready to come to class on Wednesday and we could talk about how rhythm and meter affect how we count music.